The rain pounded the cracked asphalt of Oakland's 12th Street, each drop a reminder of the life Elias Torres was desperate to escape. At 24, he'd spent years dodging shadows. His father's fists, his mother's silence, and the gnawing fear that he'd never be enough. Tonight, soaked to the bone, he stood outside a neon-lit diner, clutching a duffel bag with everything he owned, wondering if this was the end of the line. Elias wasn't supposed to be here. He was supposed to be in college, maybe studying art like he'd dreamed as a kid, sketching cityscapes in his tattered notebook. But life had other plans. Kicked out at 17 for being gay, he'd bounced between shelters and odd jobs, each day blurring into the next. Oakland's streets were unforgiving, and hope was a luxury he couldn't afford. Yet, as he stared through the diner's fogged-up window, a figure inside caught his eye. A man with broad shoulders and a warm smile, flipping burgers behind the counter like he owned the world. That man was Caleb Hart, 26, the kind of guy who radiated confidence without trying. Born in Boise, Idaho, Caleb had fled his own demons, a conservative family who saw his bisexuality as a sin. He'd carved out a life in Oakland, working nights at the diner and days as a mechanic, his calloused hands proof of his grit. Caleb was an alpha in every sense, not because he demanded respect but because he gave it freely, his hazel eyes always searching for someone to lift up. Tonight, those eyes locked onto Elias, shivering in the rain, and something shifted. Elias pushed through the diner's door, the bell jingling above him. The warmth hit him like a wave, but it was Caleb's voice, deep, steady, that anchored him. "You look like you need a coffee," Caleb said, sliding a mug across the counter before Elias could answer. It wasn't a question. It was an invitation. Elias hesitated, his dark eyes scanning Caleb's face for judgment, but found none. For the first time in years, he felt seen not as a runaway or a failure, but as a person. They talked until the diner emptied out, the neon lights flickering as the storm raged on. Elias, usually guarded, let slip fragments of his life. His love for sketching, the nights he'd slept in alleys, the ache of being invisible. Caleb listened, his hands steady as he wiped down the counter, offering no pity, only understanding. "I've been there," Caleb said, his voice low. "Not the same, but close. You're not alone, Elias." Those words, simple as they were, cracked something open in Elias's chest, a flicker of hope he thought he'd buried long ago. By 2 a.m., the rain had slowed, but Elias lingered, afraid to step back into the cold. Caleb tossed him a spare jacket from the back, its leather worn but warm. "Crash at my place tonight," Caleb said, not meeting Elias's eyes, like he was afraid of scaring him off. No strings, just a couch. Elias wanted to say no. Trust was a risk he couldn't afford. But something in Caleb's quiet strength made him nod. As they walked through Oakland's deserted streets, Caleb's shoulder brushing against his, Elias felt the first stirrings of something dangerous. Possibility. Caleb's apartment was a small, cluttered space above a laundromat, filled with mismatched furniture and the faint smell of motor oil. A single lamp cast a warm glow, and Elias sank onto the couch, clutching the jacket like a lifeline. Caleb didn't push, didn't ask questions. He just handed Elias a blanket and said, "You're safe here." For Elias, who'd spent years running, those words were a revelation. He didn't sleep much that night, but for the first time in years, he wasn't afraid to close his eyes. The next morning, sunlight streamed through a cracked window, and Elias woke to the sound of Caleb humming in the kitchen. Over burnt toast and cheap coffee, they talked again about music, dreams, the way Oakland's grit could feel like home. Caleb showed Elias a photo of his old motorcycle, a beat-up Harley he was fixing up, and Elias sketched it on a napkin, his pencil strokes sure and alive. Caleb's grin was wide, unguarded. "You're good, man. Don't let anyone tell you different." Elias's cheeks burned, not from the coffee but from the weight of being believed in. Days turned into weeks, and Elias didn't leave. Caleb never asked him to. They fell into a rhythm, Elias sketching while Caleb worked on his bike, their evenings filled with quiet conversations and shared silences. Elias started helping at the diner, bussing tables, his hands steadier with each shift. Caleb taught him how to change a tire, laughing when Elias got grease on his face. It was ordinary, unglamorous, but to Elias it was everything. For the first time, he wasn't just surviving, he was living. But the past has a way of catching up. One night, as they walked home from the diner, a voice cut through the dark. "Elias!" It was his older brother, Marco, standing under a streetlight, his face a mix of shock and anger. Marco, who'd stayed silent when their father threw Elias out, now looked at him like he was a ghost. "You're alive!" Marco's voice cracked, but his next words were sharp. "You can't keep running. Dad's sick, and he's asking for you." Elias froze, his heart pounding. Caleb stepped closer, his hand brushing Elias's, a silent promise. "I'm here." Elias's breath caught in his throat, the weight of Marco's words pinning him to the spot. 7 years had passed since he'd seen his brother, since the night their father's rage had shattered their family. Caleb's hand, warm against his, was the only thing keeping him grounded as Marco's eyes flicked between them, narrowing at their closeness. "Why now?" Elias managed, his voice barely above a whisper. Marco shifted, his leather jacket creaking in the damp night air. "Dad's got cancer," he said bluntly. "He's not got long. Keep saying he needs to see you." Elias's stomach twisted. The man who'd called him an abomination, who'd left bruises that took weeks to fade, now wanted redemption? The idea felt like a betrayal of every scar Elias carried. Caleb squeezed his hand, a subtle anchor. "You don't owe him anything," he murmured, loud enough for only Elias to hear. But Marco caught it, his jaw tightening. "This is family business," Marco snapped, stepping closer. "Who the hell are you?" Caleb didn't flinch, his broad frame steady. "Someone who cares about him," he said, his voice calm but unyielding. The tension crackled like static, and Elias felt the old fear creeping back. The fear of being caught, exposed, judged. Back at Caleb's apartment, Elias paced, his sketchbook forgotten on the couch. "I can't go back," he said, his voice breaking. "Not after what he did." Caleb sat on the arm of the couch, watching him with that steady gaze that always seemed to see too much. "Then don't," Caleb said simply. "But if you want to face him, I'll be there. Every step." Elias stopped, his chest tight with something he couldn't name. Gratitude, fear, or maybe something deeper. Over the next few days, Elias wrestled with the decision. Caleb didn't push, but he was there, cooking terrible pancakes to make Elias laugh, taking him to the cliffs of Big Sur for a break from the city's noise. It was there, with the Pacific stretching endless before them, that Elias felt the pull of something new. Caleb stood beside him, the wind ruffling his blonde curls, and when their hands brushed, Elias didn't pull away. Instead, he held on, his heart racing with a courage he hadn't known he had. "I think I need to see him," Elias said finally, his voice steady despite the churn in his gut. "Not for him, for me." Caleb nodded, his eyes soft with pride. "Then we'll go together." The "we" hit Elias like a lifeline, pulling him from the edge of his own doubts. He wasn't alone anymore, and that changed everything. The hospital in San Francisco was a maze of sterile hallways and beeping machines. Elias's father, Javier, lay in a bed that seemed too small for the man who'd once loomed so large. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken, but they lit up when Elias stepped into the room. Caleb stayed by the door, a quiet sentinel, as Javier reached out a trembling hand. "Me, Joe," he whispered, voice thick with regret. "I was wrong. I'm so sorry." Elias stood frozen, years of pain crashing against the frail man before him. Part of him wanted to scream, to throw every hurt back in Javier's face. But another part, the part that had found refuge in Caleb's apartment, in his steady presence, wanted closure. "I needed you," Elias said, his voice raw, "and you threw me away." Javier's eyes filled with tears, but Elias didn't stop. "I'm here now, but not for you. I'm here to let go." The words hung heavy in the room, a release Elias hadn't known he needed. Javier nodded, his hand falling back to the bed. Caleb stepped closer, his presence a quiet strength as Elias turned to leave. Outside, in the hospital parking lot, Elias broke, tears streaming down his face. Caleb pulled him into a hug, his arms solid and warm, and for the first time, Elias let himself fall apart, knowing he'd be caught. Back in Oakland, life settled into a fragile rhythm. Elias started sketching again, his drawings bolder, filled with the cliffs and skies of Big Sur. Caleb framed one, a sketch of the two of them laughing on his motorcycle, and hung it above the couch. Their connection deepened, unspoken but undeniable, in stolen glances and late-night talks. But the world wasn't done testing them. One evening, as they closed up the diner, a group of men lingered outside, their eyes hard and mocking. "Faggots." One spat, the words slicing through the night. Caleb's jaw clenched, but Elias grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "They're not worth it," he said, his voice steady despite the fear. The insult lingered like a bruise, but Elias refused to let it define them. He and Caleb walked home in silence, their hands brushing but not quite holding, as if the night itself was watching. Inside the apartment, Caleb's anger finally spilled over. "I'm sick of this," he said, slamming his keys on the counter. "You don't deserve that crap, Elias. Neither of us do." Elias nodded, his own anger simmering, but he saw the hurt in Caleb's eyes, hurt for both of them, and reached for his hand. "We're better than them," Elias said, his voice quiet but firm. "Let's prove it." They did, in small ways. Elias took a job at an art supply store, his sketches catching the eye of the owner, who offered to display them. Caleb started teaching him to ride the Harley, their laughter echoing through Oakland's backroads. Their evenings were filled with music, Elias's old jazz records mixing with Caleb's country playlists, and moments that felt like promises. One night, as they sat on the couch, Caleb's fingers traced the scars on Elias's wrist, remnants of darker days. "You're stronger than you know," Caleb said, his voice thick with emotion. Elias leaned into him, their lips meeting in a kiss that felt like coming home. But peace was fleeting. Marco showed up again, this time at the diner, his face drawn with urgency. "Dad's worse," he said, ignoring Caleb's presence. "He's asking for you again, Elias. Please." Elias felt the old wounds reopen, but Caleb's hand on his shoulder steadied him. "You don't have to go," Caleb said later, as they sat in the apartment. "But if you do, I'm with you." Elias nodded, the weight of Caleb's loyalty grounding him. He decided to go, not for Javier, but to close the chapter for good. The hospital visit was harder this time. Javier was weaker, his words slurred but desperate. "I want to make it right," he whispered, clutching Elias's hand. Elias listened, his heart torn between anger and pity. He didn't forgive, not fully, but he spoke the truth. "I'm building a life now. I don't need your approval anymore." As he left, Caleb waiting in the hallway, Elias felt lighter, like he'd shed a weight he'd carried too long. Back in Oakland, their bond grew stronger, but the world kept pushing back. The diner's owner, a gruff man named Sal, started asking questions about their friendship, his tone laced with suspicion. Regulars whispered, their glances sharp. Elias felt the pressure building, the fear that their fragile happiness could be taken away. One night, as they walked through a park, a group of teens shouted slurs, one throwing a bottle that narrowly missed Caleb's head. Elias's heart raced, but Caleb stood tall, his voice calm as he said, "Keep walking. They don't get to win." At home, Elias couldn't shake the fear. "What if this is all we get?" he asked, his voice breaking. "What if it's always like this?" Caleb pulled him close, his arms a fortress. "Then we fight for every moment," he said. "I'm not going anywhere, Elias. I promise." Those words, fierce and unwavering, became Elias's anchor. They spent the night wrapped in each other, the world's cruelty fading against the warmth of their connection. The next morning, Elias woke to find Caleb sketching, badly, on a napkin trying to mimic Elias's style. They laughed, the tension easing, and Elias felt a spark of defiance. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was fighting for a future. At the art supply store, his sketches started selling, small but steady. Caleb surprised him with a leather-bound sketchbook, his grin boyish. "For your masterpieces," he said. Elias kissed him, the world outside their apartment fading away. The first snow of the season dusted Oakland streets, turning the city into a quiet, fleeting wonderland. Elias and Caleb walked hand in hand to the diner, their breath visible in the cold air. Inside, the neon lights felt warmer, the regulars softer, as if the snow had muffled the world's edges. But the peace was short-lived. Sal, the diner's owner, called Elias into the back, his face grim. "People are talking," he said, avoiding Elias's eyes. "Customers don't like whatever you and Caleb got going. I need you to tone it down or find another job." Elias felt the words like a punch, his old fears rushing back. He'd fought so hard to build something here, to belong. Caleb, wiping down the counter, caught his expression and crossed the room in 3 strides. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice low. Elias told him, his voice shaking, and Caleb's jaw tightened. "Screw him," Caleb said. "We don't need this place." But Elias knew it wasn't that simple. Jobs were scarce, and the diner was their lifeline. That night, they sat on the apartment's fire escape, the city sprawling below. Elias's sketchbook lay open, his latest drawing, a portrait of Caleb, his eyes fierce and kind, half finished. "I'm tired of hiding," Elias said, his voice barely audible. Caleb took his hand, his thumb tracing circles on Elias's palm. "Then we don't," he said. "We find a way to live loud, no matter what." Elias nodded, his heart swelling with a mix of fear and determination. Caleb's belief in him was a fire that refused to go out. They started small. Elias submitted his sketches to a local gallery, his hands trembling as he dropped off the portfolio. Caleb took extra shifts at the garage, saving for a dream they hadn't named yet, a life where they could be themselves. But the world kept pushing. A regular at the diner, a burly man named Rick, cornered Elias one night, his voice slurred with whiskey and hate. You and your boyfriend think you're untouchable? He sneered, shoving Elias against the wall. Caleb was there in an instant, pulling Rick back, his voice deadly calm. Touch him again, and you'll regret it. The incident shook Elias, but it also lit something inside him. He wasn't the scared kid he'd been at 17. With Caleb by his side, he felt unbreakable. The gallery called back, a small exhibition but a start. Elias's sketches sold out, the buyers drawn to the raw emotion in his lines. At the opening, Caleb stood beside him, his pride palpable, and when Elias kissed him in front of the crowd, the world didn't end. A few glares, a few whispers, but also a few smiles, small signs that not everyone was against them. Their victory was short-lived. Javier passed away that winter, leaving Elias with a mix of grief and relief. Marco reached out, his voice softer this time. He left you something, he said. A letter, and some money. Elias didn't want it, but Caleb convinced him to read the letter. It was short, scrawled in Javier's shaky hand. I failed you, Mijo. I hope you find happiness. Elias cried, not for the man who'd hurt him, but for the boy he'd been, who'd needed a father. Caleb held him, his silence louder than any words. The money, a modest sum, became a spark. Elias and Caleb dreamed bigger, a trip, a new start, maybe a small shop where Elias could sell his art and Caleb could fix bikes. They planned it over coffee, their laughter filling the apartment. But the world wasn't done with them. One night, as they walked home, a car slowed beside them, its windows down. Faggots! A voice shouted, and a bottle shattered at their feet. Elias froze, but Caleb pulled him forward, his voice steady. Keep moving. They don't get to stop us. Spring brought new life to Oakland, the cherry blossoms blooming in bursts of pink against the city's gray. Elias and Caleb stood stronger, their love a defiance against the hate that tried to break them. The bottle-throwing incident wasn't the last, but each time, they held tighter, their hands a promise that they'd face it together. Elias's art was gaining notice. His second gallery show was a hit, with local papers calling his work raw and unflinching. Caleb, meanwhile, had saved enough to buy a small garage, his dream of fixing bikes taking shape. They moved into a new apartment, a tiny loft with a skylight that bathed Elias's sketches in natural light. It wasn't perfect. Leaky pipes, noisy neighbors, but it was theirs. One evening, as they painted the walls a soft blue, Elias paused, paintbrush in hand. I never thought I'd have this, he said, his voice thick. Caleb set down his roller and crossed the room, pulling Elias into a kiss that tasted like hope. You deserve it, Caleb said. We both do. Their biggest test came unexpectedly. A local community center, known for its inclusivity, offered Elias a chance to teach art to queer youth. It was a dream come true, but it came with a spotlight. Protesters gathered outside the center on the first day, their signs venomous, their voices loud. Elias's hands shook as he set up his easels, but Caleb was there, helping the kids, his presence a shield. One teen, a quiet girl named Mia, showed Elias her sketch, a pair of hands intertwined, much like his and Caleb's. This is what love looks like, she said, and Elias's eyes stung with pride. The protests didn't stop, but neither did they. Elias's classes grew, the kids finding solace in art, in each other. Caleb started a free bike repair workshop at the center, teaching the teens to fix flats and tune gears. Together, they built a community, a family of misfits who refused to be silenced. The hate was still there, slurs shouted from passing cars, glares in the grocery store, but it was drowned out by the laughter in their loft, the clink of paintbrushes, the hum of Caleb's tools. One evening on the cliffs of Big Sur, where it had all begun to shift, Elias and Caleb stood together, the ocean roaring below. Elias pulled a ring from his pocket, a simple band he'd saved for months to buy. "I thought I had no future," he said, his voice steady despite the tears in his eyes. "Until you took my hand and promised to stay. Will you stay forever?" Caleb's grin was brighter than the sunset, his own tears falling as he nodded. "Always," he said, slipping a ring onto Elias's finger, one he'd been carrying in secret. They married in a small ceremony at the community center, surrounded by their kids, their friends, their chosen family. The protesters were there, but so were the supporters, their cheers drowning out the hate. Elias's sketches lined the walls, a testament to their journey. As they danced, Caleb's arms around him, Elias felt the weight of his past lift. He wasn't just surviving, he was thriving, loved, and whole. Years later, their loft was filled with new sketches, new dreams. The garage thrived, the art classes grew, and their love remained a beacon. The world wasn't perfect, but they'd carved out a corner of it, a place where they could be themselves. Elias looked at Caleb, his alpha, his home, and knew he'd never be alone again. They'd faced the worst and come out stronger, their hands still clasped, their future bright.